Vos Excellences, membres de la Chambre des communes et du Sénat du Canada, invités et amis, joyeux Noël a vous tous. Excelencias, distinguidos invitados y amigos, bienvenidos a todos y feliz Navidad.
Your Excellencies, members of the House of Commons and of the Senate of Canada, distinguished guests and friends, Christmas greetings to you all. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be with you tonight. Thank you to the Christian Embassy and its trustee leader, Darlene McLean, and her team for inviting us to be your guest presenters tonight. As you might have guessed, we are just a father-daughter duo who love food, love Christmas, love Jesus, and for that matter, love the abundant life. I mean, who doesn't?
We find life and meaning in what we eat, when we eat, where we eat, and with whom we eat. And we love eating. It literally makes us who we are. Now, you might be from the I eat to live school. You're just making it through the day. Or the I live to eat school and you can't wait for your next food discovery. Whatever your perspective, tonight we'll explore our food story and the complex dynamics around food in our world.
Food's fundamental role in our existence touches our core, and its abundance brings us joy. It brings us security and happiness and well-being. But its scarcity, though, is a porter of discomfort, anxiety, fear, and much, much worse. So our collective hope is for abundance. And if we look to the book of Genesis, we already know that it is humans' wish. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's riches and abundance of grain and new wine. Mais cette abondance est-il possible? Avant d'aborder cette question provocante, nous vous proposons de vous raconter un peu de notre histoire d'alimentation et d'agriculture. Life for me was always about food and agriculture. I was born into a farm family in Saskatchewan where we didn't have much in terms of material things, but we always had great eats. My town friends used to brag about how they looked forward to big chunks of beef on the barbecue on the weekend, and I thought, what do you mean? Don't you have meat all the time? They had nicer running shoes and their dads had nicer cars, but we had nicer steaks. And I had a mom who was a fabulous French paysanne cook. We always ate well from our garden, from our fields, and from our pastures. So it's not surprising that fast forward 25 years, it was time for me to meet the love of my life. Oh, Julia's mom, just for the record. And I met her in Ottawa, of all places. She loved ice skating and she loved beaver tails. So I knew for sure that she was the one for me. But soon after meeting, we moved away from Ottawa and we had way more food and life adventures around the world. And surprisingly enough, a decade later, we found ourselves back in Ottawa, now with two wonderful food-loving kids in tow. Notre maison était une véritable ruche d'activités culinaires, avec des ragoûts canadiens classiques, des plats français raffinés et beaucoup de pain et de desserts. Food experiences were everywhere. We started a garden, we shopped markets and grocery stores together. We engaged in food tourism to places like Morocco for couscous royal and tagine, and to Asia for rice eaten right out of Cambodian rice fields. And career-wise, I became a professional foodie, Aggie, doing food and agriculture law in Canada as a university professor, as an administrative judge, as a lawyer for the Department of Agriculture, and even as a CEO of an agricultural policy think tank. Internationally, I was able to go to UN agencies in Rome, in New York, and Geneva, and advocate for food rights and food trade law principles. Well, Food for the Buckinghams was about family, play, and celebration in abundance.
And I was lucky to be born into this food-loving family. And amidst trips out to the family farm and international adventures, I think I really developed my interest in food policy when my dad came back from one of his trips to Rome to the World Food Summit, and he brought back spaghetti that was longer than I was tall at the time. And I just knew I had to learn more about whatever involved such an abundance of pasta. And growing up, I actually spent a lot of time in the kitchen. I really liked experimenting and really loved baking in particular. I actually opened my own baking business when I was 12. And looking at the need in the world, I dreamt of one day helping to end global hunger. My grand idea was to develop a cookie that was both highly delicious and highly nutritious. But unfortunately, I soon discovered those two goals are kind of incompatible and that I should never trust a recipe that says it's a healthy dessert. Les desserts sains n'en valent pas la peine. So instead, I went back to my childhood pasta dream, and in 2018, I moved to Rome to do my master's in sustainable food systems. I then spent several years working in Canada's agriculture sector and more recently moved to the Canadian Food Grains Bank, where I seek to advance policies that support small-scale farmers in developing countries around the world. En medio de todo esto, tuve la suerte de conocer a mi esposo venezolano que comparte este entusiasmo por la comida. From the Indian and Thai places around the corner that know our orders by heart to our own kitchen filled with omelets, arepas, and anything we can try to sous vide, my husband fits right into our foodie family. I think he got my dad's blessing the moment he walked through the door with that charcuterie board.
He certainly did. But, you know, when we zoom out to the worldwide food story, it gets a bit more complicated. So instead of the Buckingham Sáez family of 9 persons, we're actually talking about a family of 8,200,000,000 family members, God's image bearers on this planet. But most, not all perhaps, of us in this room tonight are among those lucky ones in the food lottery. A banquet for 8.2 billion souls, which needs to be repeated 3 times a day, is not an easy task. Given that the World Health Organization recommends average caloric daily intake of about 2,500 calories per person per day, it really is, though, quite amazing that over the past 2,000 years, when our population has increased 50-fold, that people are still finding enough to eat. Or are they? Well, let's look at the facts. Taking the entire world food production and dividing it by the number of people on the planet, we come out with an astonishing 3,000 calories per person per day. That's more than enough for everybody. And you say, well, maybe so, but what about all the new mouths to feed? We're going to have 20% more population by 2050. Will there be enough food for them too? Well, I have reason to believe that there will. There are really 2 ways that we can increase food production in the years ahead. One is to extensify. That means to find more places to grow food. And that's one that scientists and growers are already moving on. And then there's the use of new methods of agriculture. Vertical gardens using hydroponics, aeroponics, geoponics in the urban setting. And there's multifunctional agriculture, increasing the production of conventional methods with permaculture and aquaponics. Et encore, il y a le domaine de l'intensification. Since 1961, our 3 major food crops, wheat, corn, or maize as some might call it, and rice, have had their yields per acre increase dramatically. Wheat has increased 240%, corn has increased 195%, and rice production has increased 150%. And that means that we can grow a lot more of each of these commodities on the same amount of land. Now that's impressive. And we're not done yet, because there are new agricultural practices ranging from smart fertilizers to bee-applied pest control to precision agriculture, which will again increase yields and prevent losses. And scientists are now able to develop crop varieties that can grow places they haven't grown them before, like in dry places, in salty places, and sometimes those food products will have even enhanced nutritional properties. Wow, the future really looks bright, doesn't it?
Dad, I love your enthusiasm, but let's take a look at the other side of the coin. Recent years have been difficult ones on the global level. We've had the COVID pandemic, economic turmoil, ongoing conflict in many parts of the world, increases in droughts, floods, wildfires, other kinds of weather events, and the rising cost of living everywhere. Dans de nombreux endroits, les facteurs économiques, les conflits, le climat, le coût de la vie, ils s'ajoutent les uns aux autres. And all of this has an impact on people's ability to both produce and consume food. Let's look at a few examples. So in the developing context, we can look at South Sudan, where amidst a long-standing conflict, the resulting displacement has caused small-scale farmers to become quite vulnerable. Add in insufficient rainfall, persistent gender inequalities, and poor infrastructure, and as a result, we're seeing 50% of households facing food shortages. Here in Canada, about 18% of families experience food insecurity, with 5% of these being severely food insecure. So they're missing meals, they're reducing their food intake, and sometimes they're even going days without food. And a large part of this is because of the rising cost of living. With estimates up to 757 million, the number of people experiencing hunger now is actually much higher than it was about a decade ago. So now it's equivalent to about 1 in every 11 people. Malheureusement, nous sommes très loin d'éliminer la faim dans le monde. And what's puzzling is that some of the most likely people to go hungry are actually food producers. And this is because their livelihoods and their production is tied to a specific place, and they really feel the direct impacts of a lot of the challenges that I talked about earlier. In Canada a few years ago, we saw how flooding impacted farmers in British Columbia when crops and livestock barns were inundated. And while this caused a temporary disruption in local food systems, farmers were able to reestablish themselves thanks to an outpouring of community support and insurance and emergency savings, so some safety nets. And temporary food shortages were made up for by bringing in food from other places. But when farmers in developing countries experience droughts for multiple growing seasons or are displaced by a conflict, they lose their ability to produce food for themselves as well as their community. And facing their own challenges, others in the community may not be able to provide support, they might not have those safety nets, and they may all find themselves in need of food assistance. This sounds pretty grim. Is there any way forward in this seesawing between abundance and scarcity? Y a-t-il de l'espoir? Is there any hope?
Well, I have hope, Julia, because 2,000 years ago, hope moved into the neighborhood. The Christmas story we mostly see at this time of year is about shepherds and angels and stables. And there's nothing wrong with that. But really, the gospel writer John's version of the Christmas story is shorter and sweeter. The Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. Our Creator God came down from heaven to earth in the form of a human baby to signal a new era of hope, of love, and of grace, and of caring for our neighbor. And it's not just about Christmas. It's about a full-on promise for all people, for all time.
And I have hope because Jesus, during his 3 years of ministry on this planet, took every opportunity to walk, to talk, and to eat with ordinary people, meeting their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. Jesus' action only reinforced the joy we celebrate at Christmas, of the promise of a great feast and celebration pronounced by the prophet Isaiah when he said, "But here on this mountain, God of the angel armies will throw a feast for all people of the world, a feast of the finest foods, with vintage wines, with 7 courses, a feast with lavish gourmet desserts. And here on this mountain, God will banish the pall of doom hanging over all peoples, the shadow of doom darkening all nations. Yes, he'll banish death forever. And God will wipe the tears from their face. He'll remove every sign of disgrace from his people, wherever they are." Now this is a table of abundance. Food and drink for all. It's comfort from scarcity, from sadness, from death. And what's better is that in little ways in each of our lives, especially at this time of Christmas, we can have it now. We can experience a little sliver of heavenly feasting.
And this new era of hope and feasting comes with three very distinct joys that involve food: growing food, making food, and eating food. Have you ever experienced the hopeful anticipation of planting a seed and waiting for it to show its first little green leaves and eventually becoming a full-blown plant? Well, my wife and I have been directing the community garden at our church, Pine Grove Bible Church in East Ottawa, for about 10 years. And we started this project with a vision to bring just a little community together. And over the years, we have seen our community grow so that now we have plots for families, for the local food bank, and even some for the birds and the bees and biodiversity. Every year, the community garden sings of hope and the good news of abundance.
This past June, I had the opportunity to see this good news of hope when I visited Rwanda with some of my colleagues from Canadian Food Grains Bank. And as we visited different communities, we kept on being greeted with the biggest smiles and with dancing and with joy as communities told us about what it was like to grow food together and the way that they had doubled and even sometimes tripled their production by coming together, by learning together, and by implementing new conservation agriculture techniques. They were able to share in the fruit of their labor, and out of the past pain that they had experienced as a nation, joy and hope had sprouted from their community agriculture. Now, for us, we don't really know a better way to show love than to make food together. Many of my favorite childhood memories are in the kitchen, whether with my dad or making donuts with my grandma or just having fun with my friends. So when my husband and I started dating, I was delighted to find out that he also loved cooking, and we now love to cook together for others. My dad loves it when we make arepas, which are a traditional Venezuelan food. It's a pan-fried cornmeal patty, and you fill it with a lot of traditional fillings like beans or meat, but my dad really likes to take creative license and come up with some new fusion ideas. So last Father's Day, he requested smoked salmon, eggs Benedict, arepas. Talk about fusion cuisine.
Well, food is definitely one of my love languages, and I just have an idea that it might be one of God's love languages too. Making food together is a recipe for cohesion and trust and joy. When we're not making food for the family, though, I love cooking food for dinner parties and even teaching others how to cook. For 15 years, I had the joy of teaching my wife's Laurentian Leadership Center students how to pull together a gourmet meal for 20 people in 3 hours without any major cuts, blisters, bruises, or burnt offerings.
And then we get to sit down together at the table. And delighting in God's provision is such a beautiful way to honor all that went into making our food. Eating can be an act not only of hope, but also of joy and gratitude. So the Christian practice of saying grace before our meals reminds us each time that we sit down to consider all that went into making our meal, from the farmers and the crops and the animals, all the way to the hands that prepared the meals, and to recognize that it is truly a gift, as well as those with whom we share that meal. Personally, this grace and generosity of eating together never felt more sincere to me than during the COVID pandemic. I had just started working for Dairy Farmers of Canada, so I wanted to become an expert in Canadian cheeses. So we decided to do a family cheese tasting every Friday night, and then COVID hit.
And little did we know that those Friday night cheese tastings would be our beacon of hope in such a dark time in the world. Each week, come what may, the three of us gathered around the table and delighted in God's provision. 50 weeks and 150 cheeses later, the winning cheese from across Canada was declared by us to be La Trappe-Cœur, a local brie from a cheese shop just 12 kilometers from our home called La Trappe à Fromage à Gatineau. Eating cheeses every Friday night raised our cholesterol, but by grace it saved our sanity and gave us hope. Sadly, though, we remember that in many homes across Canada and in communities around the world, finding enough food to eat, let alone at a desired frequency and with loved ones, will be a challenge this Christmas. I still remember my first Christmas away from home. I was 20 years old and it was challenging in a different way. There was food, but there was no family. I was in Senegal. It was hot. The day was not regarded as a public holiday or even a feast day. And yet that Christmas day, I shared a green salad, a very exotic food in these parts of West Africa, and a fine Senegalese dish made of fish and tomato sauce called dibojin. We all ate it from a common bowl, and we were in a room filled with homemade decorations. 12 lonely Canadians shared a hopeful Christmas meal.
So at this Christmas season, we think of Jesus moving into our neighborhood and inviting us into abundant life. As much as the 24/7 news cycle might wish to convince us that we live in a world of scarcity, our God is a God of abundance. And all of us here tonight have the opportunity to sprinkle Christmas hope, love, and grace out to our families, our neighborhoods, and our communities around the world.
And it's a wish that is quite common. Even the crusty American humorist and author of the 19th century, Mark Twain, recognized when he said this: if you want love and abundance in your life, give it away. We encourage you all this Christmas season to give away both in large, exuberant quantities.
Joyeux Noël y feliz Navidad a todos.
Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.